Peace, everybody. This is Queenie Fama, and I wanted to, talk a little bit about Black consciousness and African consciousness, because I, think that Black consciousness, in my opinion, is just a precursor to African consciousness. Because in Black consciousness, you become aware of your connection to African people historically, and you begin to recognize certain aspects of the African mind as well as the European mind, and how we've been conditioned to have the same values that the European has, and ways of doing things to be able to attain those values, to maintain those values rather. And so one of the greatest teachers I've ever had, and who still is, even though he's in the ancestor realm, is Dr. Amos Wilson. And one of the first books that I literally cut my Black consciousness teeth on was The Falsification of African Consciousness, Eurocentric History, Psychiatry, and the Politics of White Supremacy, that was written by Dr. Amos Wilson. And when I think back in the 60s, I was aware of who I was as a Black woman. That was the beginning of my Black consciousness. I became aware that Black people were subjugated, that Black people were literally cast to the bottom realm of the social order here in America. And even as we look on the continent, even there as well, even though we may see Black leadership, that Black leadership has been influenced by their colonizers. So Dr. Amos Wilson, in his book, and I want to share with you a passage out of the book, out of the second lecture, which was entitled The Political Psychology of Black Consciousness. He stated that the participant in African-centered therapeutic and educational encounters discovers how he has been unconsciously conditioned by a Eurocentric system. And I'm going to stop right there, because this is when you begin to do the analysis. Now you're moving into African consciousness, whereas prior you were in Black consciousness, which means you were aware of the fact that you were Black. You're aware of, all the aspects of being Black, as far as how you look, how you talk, and certain things like that. But when you move into African consciousness, you become aware of your values, and especially your modes of behavior. He goes on to say that, let me see, where did I stop off? He goes on to say that he's been unconsciously conditioned by a Eurocentric system to respond habitually and unthinkingly to its social cues, to Eurocentric authorities and social contexts, which induce him to perceive, think, feel, and behave in certain ways. This is how you can see how people can say one thing and do another. It's because they have not begun to do that total analysis of self, as far as them being Black people, and African people in the overall African people. He also says that how he has been cued to avoid perceiving, thinking, feeling, and behaving in certain ways. How his Eurocentric consciousness, the source of his domination, is but a state of unconsciousness representing itself as consciousness.
I see you.
Eurocentric consciousness, the mortal enemy of African-centered consciousness, which it displaces and represses, imposes on its African hosts the dream states of sleepwalkers and somnambulistic wanderers in the dark of the night. So, you have to always be aware of your thoughts. And that's when we go back to Ma'at, is being aware of your thoughts and having control of your thoughts. He also goes on to say that a major educative, therapeutic, and politically liberating milestone is reached in African-centered therapy and education when the participants, be they labeled normal or abnormal, conformists or deviants, become poignantly aware of how the various institutions and practices which define Eurocentric culture are utilized to control African people's minds and behavior, prevent Africans from developing the social skills and knowledge necessary for them to be masters of their own destiny, foster the kinds of behavioral ineptitudes and deviations often labeled as deficient, antisocial, or mental illness, maintain African unawareness of the social games and rules by which that culture transforms and dominates African consciousness and behavior, condition Africans to avoid thinking and behaving in ways which expand their self-consciousness and behavioral repertoire, impair Africans' ability to master their own conduct, increase their own self-reliance and self-sufficiency, impair their ability to acquire the intellectual and social skills, the critical intelligence to solve problems of their lives, the material and capacities to determine their own future intelligently. And that is so key. What Dr. Wilson is saying here is because when you have to move from quote unquote black consciousness to African consciousness, because African people had a certain way, mode, or method of thinking and behaving. The things that we see today, the discrepancies, the what we call hypocritical ways of doing things, those are signs that we're still in a Eurocentric mindset. And we have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that we have to move into a African consciousness. He says that at the beginning of the passage what I just read, he says when the participants, that means that you are actively participating in the development of your consciousness. You see what I'm saying? You move from the rhetoric of understanding, talking about history, talking about the current conditions of African people and the causes of those conditions. You move from that into a mindset where you are now able consciously to be able to change your value system, change your behavior. This is when you move into a African mindset. As long as we stay stuck in black consciousness, we will always maintain the behaviors and ways of solving problems of the European. Quick fixes are the way of the European. You see what I'm saying? So we have to move from the black conscious state to the African conscious state. And as African people here in America, we are reinventing who we are as African people, not as just black people, but as African people. Now, I guess, some would say, well, Africa is a continent. Yes, Africa is a continent, but there was a overall moral attitude of African people that differed greatly from those of the European. He goes on to say that African peoples can best successfully counter the hegemonic interests of Eurocentric society by reclaiming their African-centered consciousness, identity, and social interests, by founding their consciousness and behavior on a accurate perception of and respect for reality and a passionate love of truth, on a knowledge and acceptance of their African heritage, a dedicated passion to achieve and maintain conscious, thoughtful, voluntary self-control, their ability to first love themselves, to maintain affectionate relationships and positive regard among themselves. The achievement of a collective, cooperative, unifying consciousness and behavioral orientation, and on the ability to engage in productive, pro-social, proactive, rather than counterproductive, self-defeating, reactionary activities. And this, brothers and sisters, is what Dr. Wilson was trying to, was telling us and teaching us. And at the very end, he says, however, these objectives will not be attained until African empowerment neutralizes or reverses the power relations and differentials which are the social foundations of white supremacy. And I will go further to add that all of this is in the mind of African people. It's in the mind of African people, because that is how you neutralize the power of those who have power over you. You have to restructure the way you think, which will also assist you in changing your behavior, which guides you into certain actions and problem solving things that you may encounter in your life. So when you become African conscious, when you become have an African centered consciousness, there are things that you will not do, no matter what. Black consciousness is wishy-washy. You may slip into the problem-solving methods of your oppressor. But when you become African conscious, you then solve problems in the African way. In other words, it's a way that African people treat others. It's a way that African people think of themselves. And this is where we have to get back to, and that, my brothers and sisters, is African consciousness as opposed to black consciousness. So, I hope that you got something out of that we have to really understand this. And Dr. Wilson also says that the metaphysical preparation to undertake such counter moves first must include the thorough decolonizing of African consciousness and the strategic organization of the African community, making it capable of creating a collective intelligence and adaptational talent, which in turn will enable it to overthrow white supremacy and achieve its liberation from oppression. The very brief outline, which and he goes into this outline, which talks about the reintegration of African history, upgrading of coping resources, neutralizing of social stressors, reversing reactionary states of the African body politic, controlling effective coping strategies and tactics, the African control of labeling and treatment processes. These are some of the outlines that he's giving us and suggestions that how we can attain those goals. So I suggest that you get this book and read this particular passage through for yourself, not just listen to what I say. But he also states that in the spirit of black nationalism, the African community must occupy and control its internal markets and resources and utilize the resulting proceeds to remediate and finance its entry into national and international markets. And that definitely has to do with, he's talking about the coping of the resources that we already have as African people. So with that said, this is Queenie Farmer. I am the Truth Terrorist. I hope you got something out of that. Please get that book by Dr. Amos Wilson. It was key for me in understanding self. Hotel.